Left alone at home in the evening, you can do whatever you want. For example, you could set up a movie night and then gorge yourself on chips as much as you like. So here you are on your favorite couch, with only the sounds of the movie's special effects and the crunching of chips to break the peace and silence. What a perfect combo. But then, suddenly, your front door swings open, crashing into the wall. Your heart jumps out of your chest, your breathing quickens, and the muscles all over your body instantly tense up. For a couple of seconds, you stare intently into the dark opening and finally realize that it was just the wind. You can exhale, laugh at yourself, and go to close the stupid door. Was there really a reason to get so scared for no reason? Or was there? In a situation like this, for a split second, you'd be as scared as if your life was hanging in the balance. After all, robbers could appear out of nowhere, and you'd have to run away very quickly, or beat them up enough to neutralize the threat. But it was not these thoughts that came to your mind first, but fear. And they appeared in your head at lightning speed. Imagine walking up to the door to close it just as an alien rushes at you. Something like this happens in the horror films that many people love to watch. It turns out that people pay money to experience fear, and they do it extremely willingly. In 2017, 219 horror films were released on the big screens of the cinematic world. Their total box office gross was nearly $2.5 billion. The leader in this category was the film It, which grossed $701 million at the worldwide box office. But most of the horror films were filmed in 2020. 281 films were released that year. Granted, 2020 turned out to be that horror movie in and of itself. And yet cinema is far from the only source of fear that people line up for. In 2013, haunted houses generated $300 million in revenue, and even more visitors go to amusement parks. In North America alone, approximately 375 million people visit these places annually. And let's be honest here, most attractions are designed to scare you. Do people really like to experience fear, enough to purposefully look for it, no less? Yes, and they pay a lot of money for it. The short answer to these questions, without going into too much detail, is yes, people love to be scared. Although we must go into some details here. The thing is, fear is context dependent. That is, the feeling that a person experiences on the rides or while watching a horror movie is one thing. And if a wild animal attacks him, or he is threatened with a weapon, that is something completely different. Although in both cases, the person is afraid. Fear is the oldest fundamental response programmed into our DNA. It evolved in the course of evolution in order to protect a living being from a perceived threat. Even when a snail hides its antenna from being touched, it's based on fear. But people are capable of more complex forms of this feeling, and all because of how our brain works, since this is what's responsible for the emergence of fear. Any emotion for the brain is just a set of impulses and chemical processes. They determine the depth and strength of what we experience, be it sheer excitement, like in a movie, or absolute horror in the event of a real threat. Our brain is like a factory for creating fear. To do this, it uses many different departments. The thalamus receives a fright stimulus from the senses and decides where to send it next. Either way, the impulse will definitely pass through the sensory cortex, which interprets the incoming data. Further along, the hippocampus is also included in the work. It retrieves real memories from storage and compares them with the incoming stimulus. This is how the brain determines the context of fear. If the brain really were a factory, then emotional women would work in the amygdala department, since this part of the brain is responsible for the memories of fear. Emotions are stored and decoded there too. In this way, the amygdala helps to determine if there is a real threat at that moment or not. But in the hypothalamus department, strong, determined men would be found working here, since after receiving a frightening stimulus, it activates the fight or flight reaction. This is what the process of creating fear in our brain looks like. Each episode starts with a fright stimulus, but then the processes follow two different paths. One is fast and primitive, the other is long and deliberate. Since fear is the oldest defense mechanism, the first reaction to it is an unconscious one. A quicker way to react to fear can be called animalistic. The only task is to instantly prepare the body for the implementation of the freeze, flight, or fight plan. It works like a sort of alarm to call the guards in the worst-case scenario. When the door to your house suddenly opens with a bang, it could be burglars. In this case, it's better to be ready to fight them or run away. So as soon as you heard the crash and saw the open door, the brain initiated the fast track protocol. The thalamus receives a signal from the eyes and ears, but it does not yet know if the threat is real or not, so it transmits information to the amygdala. This one decides to play it safe and tell the hypothalamus to trigger the fight or flight response, because if the threat is real, it'll save your life. What's happening to your body at this particular moment? Your breathing quickens, and the pupils dilate, while the heart beats faster and the blood pressure rises. The blood supply to the skeletal muscles is increased, as is that of the vital organs. But those that are not vital slow down or stop their activity. One, for example, is the gastrointestinal system. No wonder they say a person can be pale with fear. When the fight or flight system is activated, the blood literally drains from the skin into the body. This is both protecting the body and mobilizing additional resources. In the case of superficial wounds, a person will lose less blood. At the same time, the slow way to process the fright signal is also started. It takes longer since it considers all possible options available. These are determined by the sensory cortex, and then the hippocampus sets the context. To do this, it not only remembers whether there was a similar fright stimulus before, but also collects additional data. If you hear the noise of leaves outside your window, a plastic bag flies by, and branches knock on the windows, then most likely the door was opened from the wind. Then the amygdala tells the hypothalamus to stand down. But at this moment, another extremely important process also takes place in the body. Along with stress hormones, dopamine and serotonin are also released. These two are associated with excitement, but are better known as the happiness hormones. In other words, people can actually perceive moments of fear in a rather positive way, and it all depends on the context. When the amygdala signals that there is no real danger, the response to the frightening stimulus changes. The level of stress hormones decreases, and the body remains under the influence of dopamine and serotonin. And so there is an exciting feeling of pleasure from visiting a haunted house or watching a horror movie. But that still doesn't explain why people deliberately look for opportunities to be scared. After all, you can get the same charge of pleasure from hugs, candy, and a bunch of other pleasant little things. It turns out that fear helps us distract ourselves. It sounds strange, but this is how our body works. In everyday life, each of us is constantly bombarded by various problems and thoughts. Studying, work, bills, debts, fights, even ecology and politics. The world around us is constantly making us anxious. When the body activates the fight or flight protocol, the sympathetic nervous system is activated. This is the one who is responsible for preparing the body for something that threatens life here and now. At this point, you simply can't afford to give a care about any other problems. Then the fear will pass, and the parasympathetic nervous system will be activated again. Then it will be possible to think about food, sleep, and everyday existential problems again. Another useful quality of fear is social learning. We don't have to experience a situation personally to know it's dangerous. Seeing how a dog attacks another person, we learn to be afraid of aggressive pets. This knowledge could potentially save our lives. Or you can just read that there is an angry dog in the yard, and the reaction will be the same. This works in the opposite direction as well. Having met a lion in the wild, you would hardly think about whether you should be afraid of him or not. But when you see a predator in a zoo, you are likely to experience excitement and pleasure, just as it happens when watching scary films. And in all of these cases, there is one main criterion that distinguishes the so-called pleasant fear from sheer and utter horror. It's the feeling of control. It occurs when the brain recognizes that the threat is not real. Then it overcomes the primal impulse to fight and fly and simply enjoys it instead. Controlled fear gives people the ability to feel safe and less likely to react to what initially seemed scary. Can you imagine what would happen if every time you heard the knock of doors, you were preparing for an attack by robbers? When you enter a haunted house, you know that the walking dead will attack you somewhere, but you also know that they are not really dangerous. It's the same with horror movies. However, each person is unique, as are their responses to fear. What seems funny to some scares the hell out of others every time. Other people do not react at all to the same stimuli. It also depends on the context and how the brain works. It can sometimes actually just be boring. For example, a biologist is unlikely to be frightened by a film about The Walking Dead. For him, the plot would be too unrealistic for his brain to perceive it as a danger. Therefore, the biologist will release fewer hormones and get less pleasure than the other person. There might be another different situation too. For example, when the brain perceives a frightening signal as being too real, then the element of control over fear will be lost, and it will turn into true horror instead of entertainment. Even if you enjoy watching horror movies about monsters, a movie with a more realistic plot can cause such a reaction. This difference in perception is connected, among other things, with the work of the prefrontal cortex. For some, its activity may be below average, but for others, it is, on the contrary, higher. The first type of people will react less to scary things like horror movies or haunted houses. Those whose prefrontal cortex is too active in everyday life are more likely to give up such entertainment. They'll just be more scared than entertained. Also, a person may simply not have a positive experience with fun scary. If one day he had been too scared on the rides, then he is unlikely to find them fun later on. And what's probably the most surprising reason so many people like to experience controlled fear regards their memories. Going to see a horror movie, skydiving, or other nerve-wracking activity with friends makes life more memorable and colorful.